When she can't find another target, what emerges is not simply loneliness, but panic, quiet at first, then increasingly uncontainable. This panic is the result of a psychological vacuum. Her identity was never internally grounded. It was assembled through reflection, through the attention, admiration, fear, or devotion of others. In Jungian terms, the ego was propped up by external validation, not supported by a stable inner self. When that validation disappears, the structure collapses inward. This is why the unraveling feels so sudden. One moment she appears composed, superior, untouchable. The next, she is restless, irritable, searching. Not for love, but for confirmation that she still exists in the eyes of someone else. Without a new target, the mask becomes exhausting to hold. The charm no longer flows naturally. The confidence feels rehearsed. What replaces it is anxiety disguised as arrogance and anger disguised as strength. Carl Jung spoke of the persona as a social mask, useful, but dangerous when mistaken for the self. This is precisely the danger we see here. When the persona loses its audience, the individual is forced to confront what lies behind it. And what lies there is often emptiness, unresolved wounds, and a deep fear of insignificance. This is also why silence from former targets is so destabilizing. There is no mirror left to reflect the image she depends on, no emotional reaction to feed on, no role to perform. And in that stillness, the cracks become impossible to ignore. For the listener, this is not about understanding her to excuse her behavior. It is about understanding the mechanism so you stop personalizing the damage. When someone collapses without an audience, it reveals a truth worth remembering. Anything that requires your presence to feel real was never whole to begin with. What intensifies this unraveling is not the absence of affection, but the sudden loss of control. Control, for her, was the mechanism that kept inner chaos at bay. As long as she could shape perceptions, manage reactions, and dictate emotional outcomes, she felt secure. When that control slips, when no one responds, chases, apologizes, or explains, the internal disorder she worked so hard to suppress begins to surface. This is where emotional chaos takes over. You may see sharp mood swings, sudden rage followed by self-pity, or dramatic shifts between superiority and victimhood. These are not calculated strategies in this phase, they are reflexes. The psyche is scrambling to regain equilibrium. Control once acted as an external regulator for an unstable inner world. Without it, the system overloads. From a psychological perspective, this is the ego fighting disintegration. Carl Jung described how an unintegrated psyche reacts defensively when its familiar structures are threatened. Instead of reflection, it lashes out. Instead of insight, it blames. Responsibility feels intolerable because it would require confronting inner contradictions she has spent a lifetime avoiding. This explains why logic no longer works in these moments. Reason, facts, and calm communication cannot stabilize someone who is losing control over their self-image. Any attempt to set boundaries may be perceived as an attack. Any silence may feel like abandonment. The chaos is not about you. It is the sound of an internal order collapsing. For those who have lived through this, the crucial insight is this: trying to restore her sense of control will only delay your own freedom. Stability cannot be borrowed from someone who does not possess it internally. And this is the reflection worth carrying forward. When someone needs to control others to feel whole, releasing yourself from that control is not cruelty, it is clarity. As control erodes, desperation takes its place, and desperation has a way of stripping away pretense. When she can no longer secure a new target with ease, behaviors emerge that were once carefully concealed. Standards drop, boundaries blur. Old connections are suddenly revisited, not out of reflection or growth, but out of necessity. What you are witnessing in this phase is not strategy, it is exposure. This is where the illusion finally fractures. The image she worked so hard to maintain depended on abundance, an abundance of attention, options, admiration. When that abundance disappears, the persona can no longer be sustained. She may act impulsively, contradict her own values, or engage in behavior that directly conflicts with the identity she once projected. And this contradiction is deeply unsettling for her, because it forces an encounter with parts of herself she has long disowned. Carl Jung referred to these disowned parts as the shadow, the aspects of the psyche pushed out of awareness, because they threaten the ego's preferred self-image. In times of stability, the shadow remains hidden. In times of desperation, it leaks out. What you see then is not who she wants to be seen as, but who she is when the performance collapses. This phase can be confusing for former targets. You may feel tempted to intervene, to correct, to rescue, or even to reclaim the version of her you once believed in. But it is essential to understand this. What is being revealed is not a temporary breakdown, it is a disclosure. The mask is slipping because it no longer serves its function. The deeper lesson here is not about her behavior, but about perception. When someone shows you who they are under pressure, believe that version more than the polished one that existed when everything was going their way. And this is the thought to carry with you. Desperation does not change a person, it unmasks them. Your power begins the moment you stop mistaking exposure for potential and start choosing clarity over hope. When desperation deepens and the mask continues to slip, blame becomes the final line of defense. At this stage, responsibility is no longer merely avoided, it is actively rewritten. Events are reshaped, conversations reframed, and histories edited until she emerges as the injured party. This is not conscious deception in the way many imagine it. It is psychological survival. To accept responsibility would require confronting the damage she has caused. And that confrontation threatens the very ego she is trying to preserve. This is where false victimhood intensifies. She may speak of betrayal, abandonment, or cruelty, often with great emotional conviction. But conviction should not be confused with truth. The narrative serves a function. It restores moral superiority without requiring self-examination. By casting herself as the one who suffered, she avoids the unbearable task of asking how her own patterns contributed to the collapse. Carl Jung observed that when individuals cannot integrate their shadow, they project it outward. What they cannot tolerate within themselves is assigned to others. Fault becomes external. Intent becomes distorted. You are no longer a person with boundaries. You become the villain in her internal story. And once this projection is in place, dialogue becomes impossible. Any attempt to clarify is interpreted as further proof of your wrongdoing. For those listening who have experienced this, the emotional pull can be strong. You may feel compelled to defend yourself, to correct the record, to restore fairness. But engaging with a projected narrative only deepens your entanglement. You cannot reason someone out of a story they need in order to survive psychologically. The critical shift is recognizing that truth does not require your participation to remain valid. You do not need to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. And this is the reflection worth holding on to. When blame replaces accountability, distance becomes wisdom, and choosing silence over self-defense is often the first act of real self-respect. At this point, many observers mistake the collapse for transformation. The tears look real. The regret sounds convincing. There may even be moments of apparent insight where she speaks of pain, loss, or being broken. But it is essential to understand the difference between suffering and growth. Suffering happens when a system fails. Growth only happens when responsibility is accepted. Without that acceptance, collapse is not evolution, it is interruption. Psychologically, what you are witnessing is not the ego dissolving into awareness, but the ego retreating into damage control. The pain is real, but it is self-referential. The question is not, who have I harmed? But, how do I stop feeling this? That distinction matters. Real change requires the courage to stay present with discomfort long enough for insight to form. Instead, the discomfort here becomes something to escape, not examine. Carl Jung was clear on this point. Neurosis does not heal through breakdown alone. Without conscious integration, the psyche simply rebuilds its old defenses in new forms. This is why the collapse often looks dramatic but short-lived. Once a new source of validation appears, even a weak one, the old patterns quietly return. The lesson was never learned. It was merely postponed. This misunderstanding can be dangerous for former targets. Seeing her in pain may trigger empathy, hope, or a belief that this time is different. But empathy without discernment becomes self-betrayal. Pain does not equal accountability. Insight does not equal change. And vulnerability, when used to regain access rather than to repair damage, is just another strategy. The deeper truth is this transformation is rare because it demands something most people avoid: honest self-confrontation without an audience, without applause, without rescue. And here is the reflection to carry forward. Not every breakdown is a breakthrough, and not every cry for help deserves your return. Sometimes the most respectful response to someone's collapse is to let it teach them what your presence once protected them from. What ultimately brings this entire process into focus is your absence. Not your arguments, not your explanations, not your emotional reactions, but your refusal to remain available. When you step back fully, something profound happens. The external mirror disappears. There is no one left to absorb projections, regulate emotions, or stabilize an identity that depends on response. And in that silence, she is confronted with what she has been running from all along. This is not punishment. It is exposure. Without access to you, there is no immediate distraction from the inner emptiness. No feedback loop to confirm worth. No emotional leverage to pull herself out of discomfort. What remains is the self, unfiltered. For someone whose identity has been built through control and reflection, this encounter can feel unbearable. Carl Jung spoke of the necessity of confronting the unconscious, warning that what we refuse to face within ourselves will shape our lives from behind the scenes. Your absence forces that confrontation, not because you intended it to, but because you are no longer absorbing what was never yours to carry. This is why attempts to re-enter your life often intensify at this stage. It is not love pulling her back. It is the need to escape herself. And this is where your role becomes clear. Returning would restore the familiar dynamic, dull the lesson, and resume the cycle. Staying away allows reality to do what no argument ever could. For you, this moment marks a shift from reaction to agency. You stop being a participant in her internal struggle and become an observer of your own growth. You reclaim energy once spent managing someone else's instability and redirect it toward building a life rooted in coherence, not chaos. And here is the thought to leave with you. When your absence reveals someone's inner collapse, it is not your responsibility to rescue them. It is your confirmation that leaving was an act of truth, and choosing yourself now is not abandonment, but alignment.